Hello, welcome to a new episode of Share Green Design podcast. Today we have Chris Magwood with us, and I would like to say before we start that I've been following Chris on social media and on on the internet, and reading a lot of about his work. So it's a pleasure and an honor to have him with us today, and also something that he can talk about, talk to us about his work and what he does later is that is the group of people that in Canada and the US they are working together, and it's a relatively small group, I think, and they all know each other. So that's something we'll talk about. So we have common friends and other people we've done podcasts with before. So something we can elaborate a bit more. So thank you, Chris, for joining today. And if you can give us a bit of a background about your background and who you are and what you've done in your career and how you got interested in sustainability and embodied carbon and everything. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here and be talking with you. I guess my start in all of this is from the residential design and build world. So in my about 25 years ago, I started working in straw bale construction. I had built a straw bale house for myself and my family and was being asked by a lot of others to come and do that for them. And so with a couple of partners, we started a design and build firm. And so for about 10 years, we worked for people here in Ontario, Canada, who were mostly really concerned about the environmental impact of their buildings from a lot of different angles, energy efficiency, health, waste, local resources, circularity, those sorts of things. And as that practice sort of built up, we kind of came of age in the construction world at a time when greenwashing was starting to get really prevalent. And we were very sincere about the kinds of things that we were trying to do, but seeing that a lot of the advertising and the sales and the products were sort of taking one aspect of green and really promoting that, but maybe not being so honest about it in other ways. So for us, the way to combat that was to start being really thorough about measuring stuff. We wanted to be able to tell our clients, we're saying we're doing this thing for you and we can measure that we're doing it. So, we were early into energy modeling for energy efficiency. We've always tracked the waste for our projects. We've tracked the chemical content of the materials we were providing. We, tracking all of those sorts of things. And so in around 2010 or 2011, as the awareness of the climate crisis was sort of growing and realizing that, the materials we were putting into our buildings had this potentially really big climate impact, we wanted to be able to measure that. We wanted to be able to tell our clients, hey, we're also paying attention to this. We've measured the carbon footprint of all our materials. We've measured the carbon footprint of things we're not using, and we can show you, whether we're doing better or not. And I had no idea at the time that whatever 10, 12 years later, I was still going to be involved in embodied carbon. But that pursuit of trying to figure that out wasn't so easy in 2010. And I sort of just ended up going down that rabbit hole of what are these numbers? Where do they come from? Why are they so hard to get? How do I figure it out? And so I've just been really involved in trying to figure that out, specifically with the lens on the residential side of the market. I think a lot of people early on who were involved in embodied carbon were sustainability consultants and folks from large firms or large real estate companies where there's people in the office who sort of have the time and energy and ability to really explore something new like embodied carbon. And in the residential world, that's not the case. And so I've been really passionate about trying to bring that lens to the smaller scale buildings that happen in the residential market here.
And something that you mentioned about the rabbit holes, and when you start working about thinking and working and learning about embodied carbon, is something that I think it just stays with you forever, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's more, the more you know, the more you want to learn, and then it gets more and more. And it's happened the same to me on my work, and also it becomes kind of a way of living, isn't it? Is
Mhm.
efficiency. And so how you approach that efficiency on your projects from a material point of view, but also from a design efficiency point of view. So using less stuff, as you said earlier.
Yeah, using less stuff, using better stuff, and all along, even though I now have this focus on embodied carbon, it's always come from the the background of understanding the full range of issues and impacts, and trying to keep as wide and broad a lens as possible. So even though I spend all my time right now, thinking about embodied carbon and figuring out how to measure that, what I really want to do is have that knowledge, and knowledge about energy efficiency, and knowledge about material health, and about circularity, and then be able to put all those pieces back together, and make choices that aren't kind of blind to one metric or another, but that are as broad, and figuring out where am I able to get the sort of win-wins across the broadest number of those criteria. So I'm really passionate about embodied carbon, but only so I can take that knowledge and you put it together with other things, and try to bring it to the benefit of a better project in general.
And I think that holistic approach that you were referring to earlier, I think that's the key as well, isn't it? That because if we just focus on, if we just focus on embodied carbon, and because now there is a lot of focus on that in the industry, the construction industry, and in general all the industries, but we can't forget about the operational and everything you said earlier, and the chemicals used for the materials, and the circular economy. So it's that holistic approach, and that's so. As you said, then you want to learn. As the more you know about it, the more you want to learn. But then, as you realize it's impossible to know about everything, then the collaboration with experts on the different topics become super important as well. So how does that work on your work as well? And actually, you haven't told us about RMI yet, when you're working on. So whether it's RMI or in other fronts, how does that work from a collaborative environment?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I mean, it's interesting because in sort of my small design build realm, here in Canada, it's actually been possible. You can sort of be, in a lot of ways, your own in-house expert on all of that stuff. When the projects are smaller, a very small team of people doing their own research, you don't need to collaborate so much. But as the projects get bigger, the size of the buildings do, policy starts getting involved, like that's when collaboration is really key. So yeah, as you mentioned, I joined RMI a couple of years ago, and I work in the team that does have that sort of narrow focus on embodied carbon, but we sit in the sort of the whole buildings team. So we've got people who are really looking at electrification, energy efficiency, indoor environment quality, health issues, equity and affordability. So I'm one of those lenses now, but the whole RMI team is large enough and broad enough that we kind of bring lots of that expertise to whatever we're looking at, and collaborate really broadly with other groups and organizations and researchers too.
And talking about groups and researchers, you're board member of construction. Can't remember now. I have it here. So Builders for Climate Action. Sorry.
Yeah.
But you're also a member of the construction, the Carbon Leadership Forum, and I guess others. So could you tell us about that as well, and what is the environment as well in those groups, and also how the industry is working together, people from different companies gathering together in those groups, most of the times in their spare time as well, trying to share knowledge and try to move things forward.
Yeah, I mean, there are really great collaborative networks. The two you mentioned, Builders for Climate Action, I was involved in starting, and that's a Canadian-based organization that is, again, really focused on the residential sector. So that's bringing people together from the home building side. We've got, people involved who are constructors, designers, policymakers, material manufacturers. That group was responsible for making a tool called BEAM, which is an embodied carbon estimating tool specifically for the residential sector. And so, lots of great cross collaboration in that group. And then, in the US, the Carbon Leadership Forum that you mentioned, they're a great sort of umbrella organization. There's regional hubs all around North America where practitioners in different cities kind of get together in sort of regional CLF hubs. The CLF Central team is involved in all kinds of great work and research, and there's a ton of collaboration in this space in the US. As we were saying earlier, it's one of those things where, if you're showing up at an event where embodied carbon is on the subject list, you're bound to know most of the people who are there. It's still small enough topic that, there's 50, 60, 70 people across the country who are sort of key in really pushing this along. And really great. And I feel like open and collaborative space where nobody's trying to own the issue or, push one agenda or anything like that. It's really collaborative and really supportive in what everybody's doing.
And that's something that we can see happening here as well in Europe, where people are keen to share and because I think there is an understanding, and we all understand, at least the people working in this front, that that's the only way. And we still have to work for our companies, and we have our duties and responsibilities and everything. But without that collaboration and sharing of information, we can't move forward. And actually, it benefits the entire industry, I think.
Yeah.
But then but it's interesting, you said it's a group of 60, 70 people across the US, which, if you think about the population, it's very little. So even though things are changing and they are moving, sometimes I would like to think they are moving fast, still very slow, because it's a small group of people pushing in that direction. So what is your view in the short term, or what has been the change you've seen happening? We are focusing on embodied carbon, but I think I would prefer to talk about whole life carbon, including operational carbon as well. As you said earlier, we have to look at the big picture. So what's the change you've seen in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, where embodied carbon is becoming more important? And then in the last year, and what do you think is going to happen in the next 2 to 3 years? Is it going to grow quicker, or is it going to be a maintain, or how based on your experience?
That's a great question. I mean, I think for anybody who's active in a particular issue, you always want it to get bigger and go faster and have more happen. But if I look back to even 5 years ago, I was having to explain what I was even talking about when I said embodied carbon. It wasn't that long ago that you'd go to a buildings related conference and there might be one, session over in a side room about embodied carbon, handful of people there. And so it amazes me actually how quickly it has moved from a kind of topic that seemed really esoteric and off to the side to being, really thought about, considered, enacted. There's policies starting to happen. All of that has come really, really quickly in the scale of things. Like what I saw happen early in my career with operational efficiency, it feels like it took that 25, years to sort of become a central focus of the building industry. And I feel like with embodied carbon, that's happened on a way shorter time scale. And I think that's really positive. When I say there's, 60 or 70 people, like those are the people who like their full-time gig is thinking about and doing embodied carbon. But, what is happening is that's spilling over into, people inside firms, people inside government, people, it's kind of, the reach has gone way faster than I would have ever imagined it happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I have the same feeling here in at least in the UK and Ireland. So I think it's the same timing. So like 5 years ago, I was invited to an event in London to talk about, actually, it was about sustainability. I can't remember exactly the topic. And I focused on embodied carbon. And I was told there were other three people in the panel. And I was told, Juan, don't worry too much about embodied carbon. The key is operational carbon. We need to focus on that. That was 2019. And there were no more than 30 people maybe in the audience. And then 5 years later, I was in the same event, same place, and the focus was embodied carbon, circular economy, and the audience was huge. We were in the bigger stand in the event, and people couldn't see it. So it's in 5 years. So
Yeah.
I agree with you. It's like it seems slow, but it's true. It's moving fast, and I just hope it gets faster.
Yeah, it's interesting. I went to go back to school and do a master's in 2016 to like really focus on embodied carbon, and my university almost turned me down because they're like, we can't see that there's enough material on this topic to base a master's on, and that was only 2016. Like they, I really had to push to be allowed to do it because I could only show them a handful of journal articles on the topic. And, now if you do a search online, there's literally like, tens of thousands, and all of that's happened in that little window of time.
But then the other thing that's happening, as you said, there are plenty of papers out there. And, I guess you are also one of those that as you learn more, well, we said that earlier, you learn more, you read more, but that means also there are different ways of measuring embodied carbon and whole life carbon in general. There are different standards, even in the US, for example, between states. I guess we can talk about that. So what is your view about the standards and the way we measure? Because if we want to focus or base our decisions in data, we should hopefully ensure that that data is consistent. So your work on the RMI is related to that, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm involved in two standards efforts in the US. One for ASHRAE, they have their 240p, which is a whole life carbon standard that's in development now. And, it's an attempt to be a broad standard that would cover, the entire industry, at least sort of in the US, but also potentially, more globally. And also more directly, I'm leading the standards for ResNet, which is a residential energy efficiency organization in the U.S. They provide the HERS ratings, which is sort of one of the main energy efficiency rating systems in the U.S. And so those two standards, even though I'm involved in both of them, they're going to end up being different. And I think sometimes the standards end up being different because, they're trying to serve different purposes, like the residential, the home building sector that the ResNet standard is aimed at. It's a different beast than the commercial side that ASHRAE is interested in. ResNet already has an operational carbon index built into their system. So our standard for ResNet isn't a whole life carbon standard because the other standards that ResNet do are focused on the operational side. So like you're going to put the embodied carbon one together with their existing one, and you'll be able to see a whole life thing. The ASHRAE one is trying to put all of that into a single standard. So I absolutely understand and try to work towards keeping standards aligned. But I think also in the early days of a topic like this, if you standardize too soon, you also lose the potential of like newer and better and different approaches kind of coming along and being better than the standard. So that the sort of one standard to rule them all is it's a great idea until you don't like the standard that rules them all and see big holes in it. And I think we are too early now to really go like, oh yeah, there is this one way to do it, and this is the way to do it. So we should all just do it that way, even though it's really frustrating when they don't align.
But I think it's also the standard and the way we measure, for example, embodied carbon. So there are different tools to start with different databases, which make things
Yeah.
more difficult. But then there are different bodies, public bodies or private, it doesn't really matter, that they want to measure in a certain way. So then it makes it difficult. So a kilogram of CO2 equivalent per meter square here wouldn't be the same of kilogram of CO2 equivalent per meter square there, which for people that are not all day in this, they can't understand that. I mean, like, how can that be possible? So how can two people do the same calculation and take the same building, do the calculation, and get different results? And they get frustrated with that. And it's like, and you can explain it, but they still don't get it. So
well, I think, in the work that I'm doing with the ResNet standard, what we're trying to do is say, if you're talking about smaller residential buildings, this is the standard and this is how we talk about it. And the ability to compare to an office tower, maybe that's not so important. But if you can look at house A and house B, and that they're operating in the same way, that standard is the same, that those numbers are the same, that makes sense. And that's sort of what I'm aiming for with the ResNet standard, is to sort of at least have that little, it's not little, but that sector of the construction industry using the same language. But even within that, we've worked with a few cities per, CO2e per meter squared. That tells you something, but for a city that's looking at density, they might want to look at CO2e per bedroom or per occupant. That's a more relevant, thing. So I think, like, you pull different information, you can sort of like work different angles depending on how you do those calculations. And I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. I think, it's okay to have a bunch of different ways at this time to do it, and a bunch of possible answers that you could be looking at.
I think you touch on something that I'm very interested as well, which is metrics. And it's something I've been thinking a lot and talking to, with people I talk to, that group of people we meet for a coffee or to go for dinner, and you end up talking about embodied carbon and metrics.
I've been at those dinner parties,
And then it's like, okay, is the right measurement per meter square? Because as you said, is bedroom or even per person, per capita. Because, for example, if you think of a house, and I've used this a lot, is you think of a house and there are 4 people living in that house, but the house is 100 square meters. Then it's 25 square meters per person. It can have a very low embodied carbon. Or could be an average embodied carbon per meter square. And then there is another house that is double the size, 200 square meters, 4 people. Much lower embodied carbon. But per capita is the same. But one is double the size of the other one. Then you get into, is embodied carbon enough? So that's, and the other thing is how much land they occupy. And I think density is another key one, as you said earlier. Because when you do, I don't know, I would like to learn also to hear about how you do it there over in the US, is the infrastructure. Because when you work on low density, and there is some good papers that UCD here have done with the Irish Green Building Council to quantify the impact of the infrastructure on the embodied carbon and how much we should be adding per property based on whether it's a 3 stories, 5 stories, low rise. So how do you work around that as well? And because if we focus on the building only, we are missing a huge part of it.
Yeah, I agree. Currently the ResNet standard I'm working on is not going to be looking at infrastructure, and I think that's too bad in some ways, because, like you said, like we miss this piece. But on the other hand, we looked at doing that, and the attempt to do that, just, it was too much. Like it was adding too much to the scope to be able to do it. We're the way we're working on it for the residential sector is there's already a really well-established network of energy raters in the home building world in the US. So the majority of new homes that are built go through some sort of energy rating program. So you have a professional who's making a model of the house. They're looking at the energy efficiency. They're looking at the carbon emissions from the operations of that building. And they're literally making the same model for the energy model that you would need to make for the embodied carbon model. So, that the standard for ResNet is to sort of put those two things together, enable the energy rater to do the embodied carbon. But if you pull that lens back and now you're like, and let's throw in the roads and the sewers and the water lines, like nobody who's touching that standard otherwise, like they have no knowledge of that. They don't see what infrastructure that goes in. They have no way to measure it. And so, we just decided like it would be important to measure that, but it's not energy raters who are going to be able to do that measurement. So we focused our standard in on that. I think, city governments or, the land developers themselves who are putting in that infrastructure, they're well placed to measure that. And I hope they do. And if they do, love to put that together with the building specific measurements that we're doing. But it's, we just sort of realized you can only ask people to do the things that are within their wheelhouse to actually look at and measure and have access to.
That makes sense. But I'm going to share with you that document I referred to earlier because I believe it's published on Sure Green Design. And it's a 10-15 document, really well written and clear to understand as well. It was done for Ireland. But I think the results can be extrapolated. And I believe Kelly Alvarez Duran as well did some work around that. So I'll have a look and I'll share it with you.
Yeah, and I totally get that. Like the single family low rise development, it's the worst for embodied carbon. And I think in our own standard, even just looking at the building, it's very clear. Like as soon as you go from a single family home to a duplex, by all counts, by per square meter and per occupant, the embodied carbon goes down. Make that a triplex, it goes down again. Make it a quadplex, it goes down again. Make it a 3-story row house, it goes down again. So I think even without having the full infrastructure picture, even if you're measuring it by the building, the density makes a difference. And if we start seeing policies develop where they're looking to have people come under a certain embodied carbon threshold, the easiest way to do that is going to be make a building that has more density. So I think, we do need to move away from the single family typology, but I think even just at the building measurement level, you see that that's the direction that we need to go.
Yeah, I totally agree. And also when we find that dilemma as well, when we publish and we select projects for publication on Sure Green Design, there are some that are low rise and they have a low embodied carbon and they use natural materials, but at the same time, they are low rise, low density. And then there are other projects that we review and our team reviews, and they are like, okay, but this is maybe the embodied carbon per square meter, just looking at the building, looks higher. But we know it's better. And the big picture, as you say, if you step back. But there is no way, because the way we measure it is based on the square meter, to demonstrate it, it's more difficult. So I hope that also the metrics evolve and then we find another way, because otherwise we are sending the message, don't worry about the density, don't worry about that, just focus on your little thing that has a slow carbon and use local materials. Natural materials.
Yeah. So, anyway, I think I don't want to totally disregard the low-rise single-family model, because so much of what's innovative in construction comes out of that. Because it's small, because it's manageable, because the budgets are reasonable, because you can experiment. Like all the early passive house buildings were small single-family residences. All the early straw bale buildings, like you name an innovation, it didn't go in an office tower first. It was used even low embodied carbon concrete, like those mixes in North America anyway, get tried out on small buildings. And so they're obviously just reproducing that, especially in its less ideal forms, is not what we want. But like I think those small single family, natural material examples are really important, because EcoCocon is now making much larger buildings with their prefab straw panels. But if it wasn't for a bunch of people making small single family homes out of straw bales 25 years ago, we wouldn't have got there. So I think those projects are still really important, like development pieces for how the industry, it's sort of, they keep, small buildings always point the way, like, hey, we could do this, and
that's a good point. And I like that thinking as well. And now that you talk about the EcoCocon, you talk about the straw bale at the beginning when you introduce yourself. So how is that straw bale in Canada or in the US? So from a regulatory point of view, and because when we talk, for example, here about that, a small scale could be fine, but as soon as you are building a number of houses, is what about fire? What about certification and so on? So how is that dealt with there because you work with the straw bale, you said 20 years ago, wasn't it?
Yeah. So I mean, the residential codes in the US adopted a straw bale appendix back in 2015. So there's been a code path, with all the fire testing approvals and load testing approvals and everything that you need. But it didn't, getting that stuff into the code, it's helpful, but it didn't precipitate tons of straw bale building, because the system was really only, that sort of like stacking bales one on top of each other on a site. Only a handful of people can ever really do that. It's not going to provide the sort of the scale of application that you need. But now, in the US, there's 4 or 5, like still small, but companies doing prefabricated straw bale systems. In Europe, you've got EcoCocon and ModCell and a few others. And the scale of projects, especially in Europe, that they're doing are getting larger and larger. And again, I think that's the thing. It's like it starts small because you need to prove it out. But I think there's nothing particularly in the way of these things, growing larger. We've been collecting a whole bunch of case studies at RMI of these larger buildings all over the world that are using natural materials. So I think it's really just a matter of the right amount of incentive, the right amount of support to get all that testing work done. But I think lots of those systems are feasible on a bigger scale than they're being used at now.
And I think that's one of the keys as well, is making them scalable, and the tests, and who is funding those tests.
Yeah.
So, for example, in the case of the straw bale, I guess there wasn't a huge industry behind back in the testing. So how were those tests done in that particular case?
Well, in the States and in Canada, literally by, a bunch of people volunteering their time and money and effort to do it on the lowest sort of shoestring budget possible. And I think those things are further along in Europe, because there's been more government support for sort of biomaterials research than there has been to date here in North America. But I don't think any of it has kind of received the kind of attention that it deserves, because I think its climate potential impact, nobody has really wrapped their head around how big a shift that could be. And that's what I'm trying to spend a lot of my time doing, is, drawing attention to that. Like, this is not just a material swap. This is buildings going from being a leading driver of climate change to buildings being a leading driver of carbon removal and storage. And I think that, it's hard for people to wrap their head around that, but I think that the potential is there for that shift to happen.
And I think your message is getting there, because you were invited a few weeks ago to a meeting at the White House to talk about all these topics. And I read about it, I can't remember, was it 3-4 weeks ago, maybe a couple of months? I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, I think about a month ago, yeah.
Well, But I was reading and I saw a few people that were familiar, and I think Shell Anderson was there, who we did a podcast with a few months ago, and other people that I knew. And I saw your name as well, and it's like, that's brilliant that people like you are invited to that. So could you tell us a bit about that meeting, how the government gets interested in the message you are sending across, and what could come out of that as well?
Yeah, so that meeting was at the invitation of the White House. Their sort of climate folks had worked on a definition, trying to come up with a national definition of what a net zero building on the operational side is. Because like you said, these things are often defined and sort of measured differently. And so on the operational side, the White House, was making an attempt to say, this is how we're going to define a zero carbon building on the operation side. And so they, brought folks together and worked on that. And I don't know if that definition is public yet, but it should be soon. Okay. But at those discussions on the operational carbon side, a lot of the participants were like, we really should be considering embodied carbon in this too. So that meeting a month ago was to kind of come up with part 2 of the definition, which is what's a zero embodied carbon building and how do we define that? And so, yeah, it's a really great collection of people from across the industry trying to come up with not necessarily the metrics, but the sort of the broader pieces of the definition, like what do you count, what doesn't get counted, a sort of broad definition of zero embodied carbon, and it's wicked hard to do. It'll be, I'm sure we'll come up with a decent first stab. I think there will be as much for people to disagree with as to agree with, and I think we're seeing that even in the group that's working on it. It's like, there's people pulling and pushing for different things, but I think, for me, it's just encouraging that this is even on the radar of the White House, that, embodied carbon matters enough to the national, climate strategy that they want to take a stab at trying to define it. So
I think that's super important that is taken to that level of relevance and for a government. Yeah. But you talk about net zero, I would like to know what you think about that, and are we using it correctly, net zero? So, because I would like to know your opinion about it.
Yeah. Like with a lot of things, my opinion about it is mixed. I think, there are ways that you can do net zero that are not particularly honest or true to, to what you're trying to do. I think on the operational side, you can parse it out differently, but roughly speaking, if you produce as much clean energy as you use of dirty energy, if that carbon balance comes close to zero, that's a pretty, even though you can game it in a lot of ways, like that, there's an energy and emissions in and an energy and emissions out, that if you compare them, if you're around zero, you're around zero. I think on the embodied side, that definition gets way harder to do because, you're trying to decide, are you wrapping in the whole life cycle of the building, sort of the whole life carbon approach, in which case, how do you count the emissions that may or may not happen 100 years from now? Is that number that you come up with through an LCA, is that a hard and fast number? And is it in today's emission volume, or, it gets wickedly difficult to do. Are you including biogenic carbon storage in the materials, all materials in the same way? Wood gets really complicated when you start thinking about that. How do you deal with what happens to that biogenic carbon, at the end of the life cycle of the product or the building? So there's the number of variables that go into what's a zero embodied carbon building, it gets really tough to try to define. At the same time, I don't want to, personally, I don't want to get, I think it's super important to think about those things, but it's also really possible and valuable to just do what we know you can do really well right now, So on the,
And I think you're right, and keep pushing and getting, because there was, it was actually with Cheryl Anderson, and he was saying, making claims of net zero when we all know are not net zero. It kind of, I can't remember the exact words, but it's kind of against the people that are working really hard to make 25-30% reductions. And we know how hard it is to get to real zero.
Yeah.
So then someone making a claim is net zero, like it's not possible. So don't even talk about it. But anyway, it's for some reason it's a term that is becoming more and more commonly used. And then, as you said, is how you get there. But anyway, it's I think, as you said, is keep working and getting carbon reductions. So I think that's all. I don't know, like there is so much we could be talking for and have one of those dinner parties, right? And keep talking about everything. But it's really interesting. So there is one theme I wanted to talk about as well, and is again about sharing information. It's something you started doing, I don't know how long ago. It's you call it Material Mondays.
Yeah.
And you post, and again, I think it's an example of you have that knowledge, you want to share it, so you spend your time putting together to share with the wider community, and that's shared worldwide. So I read it most of the Mondays, because that's how the social media algorithm works. That sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. But anyway,
sometimes I don't do it on a Monday because
sometimes it's not a Monday. That's why I don't get it. But anyway,
it's not always consistent. But
okay, but I think it's a good initiative. So how did you start with that initiative, and what it's about, and what you would like to achieve with that? And
I think it's partly that the last 10 years before I went to RMI, actually 15 years, I was part of a sustainable building school. So it was still a design build practice, but we designed and built the buildings with groups of students so they could see how it worked and go out into their own work and start trying to replicate that. And so with the school, we had we were all about being transparent, and we were all about sharing. If you go on the school's website, there's a good in-depth case study of every building we ever did. We said what worked, what didn't work. We are open about our failures, open about our successes. So I think that sharing, that's how I operate. And when I moved to RMI, I was missing that. Like, I don't have any building projects to share, but what I do get is a lot of people. You can sort of see behind me, like people send me cool building materials, and I was like, well, this is what I can keep sharing. I'm not using those materials on a daily basis anymore, but I can keep that sharing going by sort of saying, hey, this is really interesting, check this out. And so that's kind of what's behind the Material Mondays.
Interesting. And then I think, just to finish and wrap up for today, what would you say to all those people and professionals that want to focus more on embodied carbon, but they don't know where to start with? And also to those that are not that interested, to persuade them that it's the right thing to do, and embodied carbon and whole life carbon in general.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I struggle with that one, because I guess I struggle with understanding how somebody can't be interested in this. It's kind of the future of our planet. I'm probably not going to be on the planet long enough to worry, but I've got a daughter, she's probably going to have a grandchild or a child. And so to me, it's like, you have to be interested in this if you care about any of the people around you and any of your sort of, future relations. It seems critical. And I don't know how you can make that more apparent to somebody, but it does seem like, especially in the building world, if you're involved, you're in the circle of people who are making this huge impact on the climate, and it just seems like you have to be interested in changing that. for those who are already getting interested, I think there's lots of great pathways in. Depends a bit on where you are, but joining a carbon leadership forum hub if you're here in North America, there's lots of those now. That's a great path in. There's lots of great books and resources and online stuff. Your podcast, I think there's lots and lots of resources. And what I see is more people kind of opening that door or like sticking their foot in, and then kind of like, whoop, you get sucked in because it's interesting and it's engaging, and my whole life in the building world is like, what keeps me going is not doing exactly the same thing I did last year. It's like, I did that, and now like, how do I find like better than that? And then once I've done that, how do I find better than that? And I think a lot of people in the building world have that mentality. So it's like understanding that like, if you start doing this, it's like, it's kind of addictive. You get to,
and you want to improve, isn't it? And
you get to improve constantly. Yeah.
And it's not about competing, isn't it? It's about improving, and it's just you just want to do better. It's not. That's why I think it's also about the sharing. It's not about I want to do better than Chris. Is we have to do better, and it's.
I mean, I want you to do better than me. Like, it's great if you do. Like, that's excellent. Yeah.
Okay, that was really good. So thanks very much, Chris, for your time. It's been
my pleasure.
Very inspiring.
A fun conversation. Yeah.
And I can see why you are invited to the White House to talk to the other colleagues as well. And I hope that your message gets out there to more people. As you say, you hear someone like you talking about, it just makes so much sense. That is, how can you not consider that? It's the way we have to work. So anyway, thank you very much again. And just to everybody to remember that we have previous podcasts in our website, sharegreendesign.com, and we'll continue doing podcasts with people like Chris. And thank you very much again. And I hope to see you around and reading your material Mondays and the work you're involved with. And I hope you keep going and with that same passion and dedication.
Thanks.
Thank you.